Sugali, everyone. My name is Erica Dockstader. I'm a lawyer and member of Oneida Nation of the Thames. Thank you for tuning in today to learn more about Oneida Nation's proposed custom election code. This code is being considered as a fundamental instrument towards Oneida's self-governance journey, allowing us autonomy over our election process and removing any decision-making powers from Indigenous Services Canada. Over the next 15 minutes or so, we will explore what custom election codes are, why they matter, and end off with an overview of Oneida's draft custom election code and its interpretation. Before I get started, I just want to point out that I will be referring to Indigenous Services Canada as its abbreviation ISC throughout this presentation. The specific topics outlined in this presentation include what are custom election codes, why were they developed, and how do they work, statistics, Oneida's custom election code, a simplified approach, benefits of a minimal code, Oneida Nation's custom election code overview, current status and voting process explained, and finally a conclusion and path forward. Custom election codes are a set of rules and regulations developed and implemented by First Nations to govern their own election process. These codes can be tailored to meet the unique needs and cultural values of each community. Custom election codes are a response to historical challenges. They're all about restoring and strengthening the sovereignty and self-determination of First Nations communities. In other words, they empower communities to govern themselves and make decisions that reflect their values and traditions, and to make steps towards getting out from under the Indian Act. Each First Nation develops its own code, often through a community-led process. These codes outline how leaders are selected, how elections are conducted, and how disputes are resolved. It's basically like a blueprint for how a community's government operates. I wanted to quickly show you some comparable statistics for First Nations community election processes. 54% of First Nation communities hold their elections according to community or custom election codes. 28.6% continue to adhere to Indian Act provisions like Oneida does currently, and 14% of bans are under the First Nations Election Act as defined by Indigenous Services Canada. I'm not going to go over the First Nations Elections Act just because that's not the route that Oneida has chosen to take. However, you can conduct your own research on what that is if you're interested. It's on the government website, easily found online. Again, that's the First Nations Elections Act. Communities who have implemented custom election codes have reported three main successes: strengthened self-governance, increased voter turnout, and greater community unity and resilience. So if you've had a chance to review the code available on Oneida's website, you probably noted that it's pretty basic and does not include elements of language and culture. This is intentional. Oneida has gone about this by drafting basic terms to meet minimum standards required by ISC to get out from under the Indian Act. Once the custom election code is approved, the community can decide what our code looks like. In the next slide, I'm going to explain the benefits of a minimal code at the ISC negotiation stage. The first benefit is flexibility and community autonomy. A bare bones agreement allows for greater flexibility and autonomy at the community level. Oneida can determine their election process without interference from the government. Number two, avoiding cultural imposition. By not including specific cultural elements in the agreement, it avoids the risk of imposing government-defined cultural standards on our nation. I think that we can all agree that we do not want the government approving or disapproving our cultural and linguistic structures. Number three, reduce bureaucracy and faster implementation. A minimal agreement means less red tape, making it easier to navigate the implementation process. This streamlined approach can save time and resources. Number four, minimize risk of conflict. By avoiding specific language and cultural requirements in the agreement, potential conflicts or disagreements related to these components during these negotiations may be minimized, making it easier to reach goals to remove our process from ISC. I think that it's also important to point out that the challenges of this approach also exist. One obvious challenge is the increased opportunity for conflict arising out of the election process. The code is not comprehensive, and the minister will not resolve any disputes arising from it. Conflicts could go on without resolution for a long time, if not permanently. So that's something to consider also and weigh against the benefits. Okay, so now we're going to go over Oneida's draft code in a bit more detail. I will begin by giving some background into the work that has been done. Then I'll explain the process for having the code ratified, followed by a summary of the most significant changes from the Indian Act. Finally, I will chart out next steps in the process as set out by ISK. Here is a visual timeline of what has happened with the custom election code since 2020. I would like to point out first that the draft code was originally created and voted on in the early 2000s. There was a ratification vote in 2003 that did not pass the code, and I'm guessing the project was dropped from there. Getting a custom election code in place was identified as a priority by the 2020 to 2022 Chief and Council. A committee was formed to review and update the draft. Several review meetings were held since February 2020, and changes were made based on ISK negotiations. I have provided the dates of each of those meetings on the timeline for you to see how things have progressed over the past few years. A project coordinator was hired mid-October, who is yours truly, me, and the CEO, Sherry Monastersky, and I met with ISK on November 2nd to discuss the timelines and funding issues associated with the draft. I will talk more about the outcome of that meeting in a bit. Community meetings are scheduled for December 2nd, 2023 at the fairgrounds, as well as December 9th, 2023 on Zoom. Please note that the notice that went out to the community stated that the Zoom info session was on a Sunday, but it is not. It is on Saturday, December 9th. I will be submitting any revisions based on those meetings to ISK by January 5th, 2024. The ratification vote will then be held sometime between March and May 2024, but we will send official notice to the community once the date has been confirmed. So now I want to explain a little more about how the process works to make changes to the draft and give you some insight into how tight the timeline is that we are working with. This is based on information that I received from ISK in our November 2nd, 2023 meeting. Proposed edits are submitted to ISK. I am advised that it takes about 3 to 6 weeks for them to review and return the draft with comments. ISK provides comments and recommendations based on Canada's regulations. Those comments are either required, strongly recommended, suggested, or just edits. Then we are to make any required changes and send back again for approval of a final draft. This takes another 3 to 6 weeks. Once we have the final draft, we can hold the ratification vote. If the code is ratified, there is a bunch of paperwork that needs to be filed with the Minister of ISK for final approval. I was informed that this process takes longer and is done in about a 3 to 6 month time frame. We need to have this approval by July 8th to have it take effect for the same election year. For this to happen, we are essentially relying on ISK to fulfill their responsibilities within the earlier of each proposed timeline. If each step takes max amount of time, we will not have the final draft approved by the early July deadline. So you may be asking at this point, what are the changes proposed in Oneida's draft election code and how are they different from the Indian Act? So we do not have time to go through each change in the code specifically, but I think it's important that I highlight the most significant differences. So the major changes are the proposed length of term is 4 years rather than 2. We can make it whatever we want, but the standard is 4. 4 years would ensure that councillors are in office long enough to actually see projects through from start to finish, but not too long of a time span for replacement if they're not effective. It is proposed that council move to a full-time office regime, meaning all councillors will work full-time as councillors and not hold other regular jobs simultaneously. The hope is that council will be more effective if they are dedicating full-time hours to governance work for the nation. Considering the budget for the expansion to full-time council salaries, the number of councillors is reduced from 12 to 6, 1 chief and 5 councillors. We cannot really consider more at a full-time capacity at the moment unless we can find and secure more funding to put towards council salaries. This is something that's being looked into. Only registered Oneida members can run for elected office. As most of you are probably aware, the Indian Act does not provide that you actually have to be a member of Oneida to run for council. So this code changes that. The draft code also gets rid of all references to the nation as a reserve and uses settlement instead. It's important that it is recognized that we have unique title to our land. Some minor changes are that there is a requirement that all candidates produce a CPIC and will not be eligible for office if they've been convicted of a serious criminal offense in the past 10 years. The Indian Act has no requirements for a criminal background check or ineligibility based on a criminal record. Candidates must be present for candidates night to remain on the ballot and must make intentions known to the electoral officer as to which office they are running, either chief or council. Any appeals arising from the election process are to be determined by a tribunal made up of community members rather than the government. I just wanted to give you an overview of the current status of the project as well as next steps. The ISC final review for the current draft was completed April 2023. The draft code has been available for review on Oneida's websites for a few months now, I believe. I was hired mid-October to engage with the community and revise the draft if needed. Community meetings have been scheduled to present the draft code. An in-person meeting was scheduled for December 2nd, 2023 at Fairgrounds at 11 a.m. till 3 p.m. A Zoom session is to be held the following Saturday, December 9th, 2023, 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. Email for that link. I will provide the email at the end of this presentation. Please note again that the Zoom session is on Saturday, not Sunday. If passed, coordinate moving to the custom election code with ISC. If revisions are required by the community, continue with the process until a decision is made. Oneida leadership is working on a financial analysis and engaging in timeline negotiations with ISC. The strategy is to continue with the process, whether we get it done in time or not. We will try, and the worst case scenario is that we miss the deadline and have to wait another 2 years for the code to take effect. There will be a community referendum vote sometime between March and May 2024. This is obviously dependent on final draft approval. The process is akin to an electoral process, such as notice periods, mail-out ballots sent to every eligible voter to which Oneida has an address, and an in-person poll. The results will be provided in a report and posted on Oneida's website, social media pages, newsletter, and at public areas in the community. Ratification is by majority vote, which is 50% plus 1. So in conclusion, custom election codes are a vital tool for First Nations to regain control over their governance and decision making. It's a means to uphold cultural traditions and promote self-determination. The code represents a pathway toward a more equitable and inclusive future, respecting the rights and values of the community. Yawan for your time and attention. If you have more questions or would like to continue this discussion, please feel free to email me at cec@oneida.on.ca. That is also the email where you can access the Zoom link for the December 9th community information session. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope that you found this presentation helpful. Nagiwa.